Coming up, the Brooklyn Nets capped off their preseason with a breakout performance from veteran Cam Johnson. They also secure the final of their 3 two-way contracts and make a decision on Killian Hayes. We tie a bow on the preseason, all coming up next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast, right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. He's Doug Norrie. I'm Adam Armbrecht. We thank you, as always, for making us your first listen of the day. We're 100% free on all those great platforms and let you know that you can keep winning big all season long with FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet, and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started today. And, Doug, the preseason is over. We're just a couple days away from Brooklyn Nets regular season basketball, but there are still a few things to tie up in terms of the roster, and then also some narratives that I think are going to be pretty exciting for Nets fans in terms of trade possibilities as we start the regular season.
Well, hopefully, I mean, with Cam Johnson might have just saved did his all-time best performance in a game that doesn't count. I gotta love that. I mean, if anyone understood the assignment here, it was Cam Johnson in the final Toronto Raptors preseason game, because the game didn't mean a thing. I mean, they lost anyway, so who cares? But the game didn't mean a thing. So, don't have to worry too bad about the tryhards out there. And then he just goes out there and just drops 32. 7 of 14 from the 3-point, actually takes a lot of shots that aren't 3-pointers, 11 for 21 from the field. Couldn't ask for a better performance for a guy that the Nets are, rightfully thinking and hoping to trade during this season. So, and if you want to cap off the Nets preseason in the right way, it's set the culture of, hey, tanking, no problem, lost the games. But for guys who might have some trade value out there, send a little message to the league that wouldn't this guy look good on your team? And Cam Johnson did that in that final game.
No, yeah, of course. And as you say, Nets lost, by the way, just in case anyone was worrying about that. But it is interesting because we've said all offseason, and we're going to talk about Martin picking up the third two-way contract, Killian Hayes here as well, because it did have to. The Brooklyn Nets refine their roster down before the regular season. But when it comes to Cameron Johnson, like we said all offseason, okay, Dorian Finney-Smith, he's still that guy, 3-and-D wing. We understand maybe the value is a little bit less. What will Schroeder look like in terms of value? We've kind of started to now put Shake Milton into that mix of, could the Nets get some value at him as we think forward to the deadline for the upcoming season? But the Cam Johnson one was, well, the contract is there. It's not nothing. And the injuries are there, and it's not nothing. So hard to necessarily see that a team would immediately swoop in for him. And also, if he can do a couple things like that, if he can give you 3 or 4 games like that early in the year, then I at least think that you'll get a handful of rosters and a handful of rumors that'll say, hey, if this guy can stay healthy, then you are talking about a player that people already know has that type of scoring value. But maybe it changes that narrative a little bit, and you tamp down the injury concerns if you see games and you think, hey, this guy could bubble up for 30-point performances every so often. That's a different type of needle mover than a Dorian Finney-Smith off the bench, than a Schroeder being your, backup point guard on your roster. Cam Johnson actually can move the needle in a big way for playoff teams looking to maybe go a little bit deeper this year.
For sure. He can shoot the ball. We've known that for a long time. He's a player that can play playoff minutes. Like, we know this also. Yep. These are important things to the teams that he would want to be, that would be looking to trade for him, right? They have to have some playoff intentionality, have some money to spare, and need shooting. There are some teams out there that fit that mold. Always what's been so difficult over this, last many months, especially when they started really aggressively, signaling that this was kind of the end of an era and they were going to tank, was that finding trade partners that fit into the salary zone for Cam Johnson are a little more difficult, right? When it's salary plus assets, right? Salary plus a pick gets a little harder for him, right? He's like just not quite good enough to really probably get people super excited to be saying, hey, we got to send back X money and we have to send a first-round pick. Like, that's a tough pill to swallow, I think. And so his contract becomes a little difficult along those lines. DFS, Dorian Finney-Smith, his contract sort of sits in the same zone of teams would like to have him. I don't think there's never been an issue there. I think it's clear the teams want to have these guys on the team. It's just that at what price do you pay? That's always the question with trades, is that, right, yeah, okay, we can add these guys. It's unfortunately money and assets are part of the equation too. You don't just get to send the guy over on good vibes. So I think that's going to be probably continue to be the issue with and what you said before is a concern is that if they get hurt, right?
Yeah.
If they get hurt, then I don't know what you can do with it. And that has bitten the Nets in the past come trade deadline with guys they wanted to trade, but they just happened to be hurt at the time. And it was just too difficult. You think back to Joe Harris was a good example of this. It was like, all right, they want to trade him and he's got a foot problem. And so
Curry, another good example, right?
Right? Like these guys, they're just hurt. And what can you do? It's hard to convince him. So there is a risk there that injury crops up, but there's no question that there's a decent amount of teams that would love to add him. It's just, what are they going to send back? I think that's probably where the Sean Marks and company have been stuck for months.
Yeah, and I think the only other add-in that I put to this when we talk about coming out of the preseason, Nets finish at 1-3. No one cares about that. But from the veteran standpoint, the Dorian Finney-Smith one I think is interesting just to watch here. 3-point shooting was not good in the preseason. Does that matter? No, probably not. The same way that Cam Johnson's performance in the final preseason game. Does it matter? Well, not really. But maybe, depending on how things trend. And I just do wonder about how long they kept Dorian Finney-Smith around, an opportunity maybe to move him a little bit sooner, and whether or not, if he starts to look a little bit older or moving a little bit slower, if the 3-point shot doesn't quite get there, then all of a sudden you're talking about a guy. It's a player option. We all understand where it stands on his contract in terms of the end of the season, but it may just look a little bit differently. It may feel a little bit different. And the only good news from Sean Marks and the Nets is it doesn't matter nearly as much as it did in years past. And if you end up not getting value that you think you should for these guys, it's not as damaging to the future going forward. That being said, we still have other things on this roster, like what happened with Killian Hayes. By the way, if you follow the show, we all understand. One of us comes on here, in this case, it was me. Everything points to Killian Hayes making this roster. It was within 24 hours that they announced they were waiving Killian Hayes. We'll talk about him obviously going to Long Island and trying to continue his professional career, basically. And what about Martin and what he accomplished for himself and making a little bit of noise on this roster as the third two-way. We'll get into all that as we continue today's Locked On Nets episode in one moment.
All right, before that, we're going to let you know that this episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. What's something that scares you? Look, this Halloween's coming around the corner. We're all thinking about our fears. We're thinking about the big stuff, the small stuff. You can let those ghosts and goblins get in your way. Sometimes it can just be the stuff that's actually in your life that's around that corner that you have trouble thinking about. It just scares you to even address the things that are there for you. Sometimes not facing your fears in the first place. That's the exact thing that's holding you back. If you benefited from therapy before, if you're new to it, this is where you want to get started, right? With BetterHelp, they're going to make it very, very easy for you to connect with someone online. It's designed to be convenient. It's totally flexible. It's 100% suited to your schedule. You got to fill out that brief questionnaire. You got to get it matched with a licensed therapist. Switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Look, folks, you got to talk about this stuff, right? The things that are scaring you out there, they're just going to keep scaring you if you keep it bottled up. Get it out there. Talk to someone who cares. Talk to someone who can listen. Talk to a professional. Overcome your fears with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA.
All right, so as we continue today's Locked On Nets episode, preseason done, regular season Wednesday night. We're going to have our predictions for the year coming up on tomorrow's episode Tuesday, so be around for that. It's going to be mostly about what do the young players end up accomplishing, who gets traded first, all of those great things, and maybe some broader NBA stuff as well. And then Wednesday, obviously, game preview. But before we talk about the two-way contract with Martin, before we talk about Killian Hayes, is there any other veterans, anybody else that you looked at the preseason in any way and said, okay, this is a guy to watch early on? I mean, Schroeder, just standard. Shake Milton, we set him. But any other veterans that you look at and think maybe it's more interesting now than it was when we were coming into training camp in the preseason games?
I mean, not really. This preseason, frankly, played out pretty much as expected, with the understanding that you just can't get a good sense of what the team wants to do when guys aren't hurt, right? The absence of evidence here in this case is not evidence. Like, we don't know what the plan is with Trendon Watford, where he fits into the rotation. Yeah. We don't know, if is Daron Sharp the backup center or is Noah Clowney the backup center? Like, we don't really know that. And so,
yeah.
I could go either way on that based on things that the Nets have done in the past. So I don't think we learned a ton more. We still have some question marks, mostly just around those guys that didn't get a chance to play, because the preseason does help shake out some of those pieces. Like, we got really clear intentionality around where Noah Clowney fits, right? Okay, Noah Clowney, well, he's the sixth man right now, probably something like that. Sixth, seventh man, the best. We saw Jalen Wilson get the start when DFS. That's a really encouraging sign for him, right? Like those things are great. It feels like those are super sticky. And again, no Day'Ron Sharpe, no Trendon Watford. It's hard to exactly know. In terms of guys who just jumped out, look, we talked a ton about Zaire Williams. I think we'll do some stuff on the predictions side for him later on in the week, but that I thought we saw some encouraging stuff here, but I don't think anything really was too surprising on like this player level. I mean, did something stand out to you? It sounds like
no Ben Simmons epiphany for you, Doug. You didn't have a revelation.
2 shots in 25 minutes. Like, what are you going to do? 2 shots in 25 minutes in the final preseason game. What are we getting excited about here? It's fine. He looked healthy. He looks fine. He ran up and down the court for 25 minutes. That's a great sign. But again, the usage was like 8%. Like what? This is just. Although I will say a tease for later in the week. There was an over/under put on how many games he would play this season, which I thought the number was fascinating in what's probably in the liquid market. But no, I mean, does anything jump out to you? Because those things, the Simmons, none of that stuff was surprising to me, really, in the slightest.
No, and I think you really what you talk about between Watford, which we mentioned at the end of last week, going to that final preseason game, and then Day'Ron Sharpe too. Like I think you're right. Like we know that there's certain players that have very clear abilities, but how do they fit in when you talk about Noah Clowney? When we talk about Zaire Williams, when you just start to look at some of the either young players into their second season, talk about guys you're taking flyers on. This is the type of year where Trendon Watford's a good example of a player that, okay, we thought he was going to start to carve out an opportunity for himself. And I still think he will, but it looks a little bit different because there's a few more players inside of that front court now. Likewise for Day'Ron Sharpe. Well, we always thought he was going to develop into a little bit more, but his minutes get dropped off at the end of last season. He's injured to start this year. And I think maybe, unlike in years past, I think there is a real world where hot hands start to get minutes and you may just not see the court for a little while. And then when your sample comes, when the opportunity comes knocking, injury or otherwise, if you start to carve out a role for yourself, great. But I don't think Jordi Fernandez is going to walk in the door here feeling like he's beholden to anybody, really, in terms of minutes or rotations and how you want to construct things beyond the veterans and some of the stuff that we talked about before. So, no real surprises for me. I will say, because we're going to move on from this, but the Ben Simmons thing is always it's just fun for me because I still had people saying, well, what about the buyout for Ben Simmons? Like, why don't the Nets, think about a buyout? And the world where no matter what Ben Simmons looked like this preseason, $40 million. I mean, for me, it feels like a lot of money. Even for guys that have already made millions, it's so much money that conversation about him preventing younger players from developing or otherwise, I just don't. I'm not bringing this up because I have a real sense of it, but the idea that the Nets would ever consider it at any point this year because they want to signal that we still respect players. And if we got to a place where Ben Simmons was just stopping us from running the team the way we wanted to, because we felt like we had to trot him out there, I don't know if that ever gets to a point where they almost buy him out for full freight to not have to play him. Does that make sense to you, like on that end of it, where if you're paying him and he's on the roster, you have to play him. And maybe you just full blown pay him so he's not on the roster so you can play everybody else. Like, does that resonate with you at all?
Yeah, I mean, it does. I don't know. Okay, so a couple things. One is
a little word salad there for me, so feel free to parse that.
No, it's all good. It makes sense. So 2 pieces. The one, buyouts usually only crop up when they're actually going to happen. Right. And then you never hear, and you do not hear about it otherwise. You don't hear about like teams trying to do it and they can't agree. Usually. Things don't usually become that contentious. It's just kind of like, hey, we got to play out the string, and that's just what it's going to be. So I really don't think we would hear about that. I actually just don't think it's an option. I don't think that Simmons would ever agree to it. So, and I wouldn't either, by the way. If it was me, I would never agree to a buyout, like and take less money. For what? Like, that's not how it works, right? Come on the labor side here, pro union, pro labor. So I don't think that's really an option. I also wonder too, with Simmons, there's some world where let's say there was a world where the Nets kind of just didn't see it. It wasn't going to happen. It's just not working. It's blocking other younger players. there's such an injury concern here that might solve, like that solves that issue for them. And it sounds gross to say it that way. And I'm not no one's rooting for an injury. I do not want him to get injured. I want him to play the whole season healthy. I think the team is more fun if he plays well. We've said that forever. Right. So, and I don't think he you don't risk the tank by him playing well. So no. I think I want him to play all the games. Okay. But there's just such an injury risk here that it's almost for certain that doesn't play enough games for it to matter really anyway. The guy's averaged 28.5 or 28.25 games over the last 4 years. And that dates back to his last healthy season in Philly. And everyone's going to say, oh, well, he played zero. You played zero in that 1 year. Yeah. Okay. That's more incriminating. It counts more. It counts more.
Right.
It counts more than it counts more than just an injury because you sat out for something that wasn't an injury. Said that ad nauseum too. So yeah. I just think that this thing either works out one of two ways. He plays really well, plays the whole season, gets himself another contract somewhere else for some money at some point, or he just doesn't. He just in the back, too many back surgeries and other stuff, and it just cascades, and he's a huge injury risk as it is. So I just think those are the two outcomes. I don't think a buyout, and I really don't think a trade are possibilities here.
No, and that's really just the thing of it for me is watching into this season. We'll talk. That's not prediction related, so we're not going to discuss this when we look for what we expect for the season overall. I don't think, but the idea of getting into a point of the season where you go, well, we know the sample size doesn't work with Nick Claxton, and we want to play certain players, and how do we make sure we develop good rotations where everyone's developing in a positive way throughout the season? At any point, do they look and go, as you mentioned, if you're going to give me 20 plus minutes and 0 of 2 from the field, well, at some point, we're just going to have to reduce your role. And I hope that Jordy Fernandez and the Nets are willing to do that in the final year of his contract. It's not just about Ben Simmons. That's about Johnson. It's about DFS. It's about every veteran and every young player. Just give the guys run that are deserving of it and make sure you're pulling all in the same direction. That being said, now, coming up here in a second, let's talk about the final two-way contract. Tyrese Martin, listen, kind of a guy that went under the radar here the entire summer, the entire training camp, and the entire preseason. He's going to be ready to come up from Long Island potentially throughout the year. And then also Killian Hayes trying to keep his NBA life alive. We'll dive into that to close things out in just one moment.
All right, before we get into that, tell you about our friends over at FanDuel. NFL fans, NBA fans, you can start the season or continue with the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Maybe you got a hunch in the middle of the game. Maybe you got a hunch before the season starts. You can check out the latest stats. You can view the live play-by-play. So much more on FanDuel on the same page where you place those bets. You want to get in some net stuff early on this season. They play the Hawks to start the year. +8 starting the season on the right foot here. +8 going into Atlanta to face the Hawks. So you think the Nets are going to surprise some people? Go grab that. Grab the Nets with some points. Maybe they shock the world here and win the first game, God forbid. You also want to just be really pro Cam Thomas right now. 8th overall in scoring leader odds right now, +5,000. There's some pretty good names above him right now. But Cam Thomas, old friend, is going to have a chance to compete for the scoring title. Just some of what you can get into over on FanDuel. You get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 real money bet. $200 in bonus bets with that $5 real money bet. That's FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook.
All right, so as we wrap up today's Locked On Nets episode, tying a bow on the preseason, starting to look ahead to the regular season on Wednesday night for the Brooklyn Nets. But first, a quick note on the side here. Congratulations. There's a championship in Barclays, baby. Already locked it up. Championship complete as the fellow New York Liberty home sharers to the Brooklyn Nets there at Barclays. They brought home the championship over the weekend Sunday. So congratulations to them. Maybe there's something that the Nets can learn as they try to get their rebuild underway. Other news here for the Brooklyn Nets, obviously, is roster related. We talk about Tyrese Martin. He ends up grabbing the final two-way contract. They only had 4 games for the Brooklyn Nets in the preseason there. Obviously, he averaged 5 points and a couple of rebounds in his 12 minutes of game action. But you go back when he played with the G League for the Minnesota Timberwolves, he was an 18-8 guy. And then over the course of the summer, he also gave you 11 points and shot over 40% from deep. So the thing I wondered if you would agree, is when I saw another two-way contract for another wing, I just thought, okay, the phone lines are open and maybe the Nets are, preparing for what does it look like to clear out some veterans and how do we make sure the guys on two ways are guys that are ready to step in and fill out the bench, maybe behind a Jalen Wilson and behind how they're going to use Noah Clowney as well, right? So good for him. 25-year-old. He's bounced around, but he is easily, I think, been one of the more consistent contributors that you can squint and say, yeah, you could come to the NBA for stints and give us some solid minutes.
Yeah, and these are the kind of guys it's still worth to take flyers on, right? Like we have such a small sample size here that it's hard to make any grand determinations. But if you're not sure, you should always bet on like size and some athleticism and then see what you can do with the rest, because those are the things that you can't really, improve. Like you can improve athleticism to some degree. You can't really improve size. You are just the size that you are. So if you're going to be 6'6", if you're going to be able to be at least somewhat willing to shoot threes, even though it hasn't totally happened on the NBA level, I'm all for these kinds of moves. I don't think it's going to be any great impact. We could kind of see it coming with where the rotations were going earlier in the preseason. The Nets have always just been wing heavy. That's just where Sean Marks has wanted to do business. I think mostly that's correct. When you're asset building too, now being wing heavy is for sure the way to go, because those are the guys, easiest guys to fit into places are 3s and 4s in the NBA. If you're a 3 or 4 that can shoot threes at all, teams will want you. You're not going to be a max contract guy, but you're going to be wanted around the league. So I like these kinds of moves more than say like the Chris Chioza or the Mike Jameses of the world, right? That's like Jacob Gilyard, right? These kinds of guys that have had pit stops with the Nets, all nice players, fun to watch them get up and down the court, but it's a tough sell because they're super small, right? And so I'm just pro these moves without having any great huge take or definitive take on like the Tyrese Martin story. Like I don't think I have one there, except that I like the move.
Yeah. Mostly just, hey, guys bouncing around. I just like seeing guys get opportunities, right? And if you're going to be a player trying to show something and maybe give yourself a chance beyond this season with other teams, guess what? The Brooklyn Nets are the spot for you, because they're going to have openings, they're going to have minutes to fill, and you'll get the best chance probably to showcase yourself. The other one obviously is Killian Hayes. Nobody, and I mean nobody, talked more about Killian Hayes this offseason than the Locked On Nets podcast. He ends up getting waived, but you go back to last week and Jordi Fernandez talked very glowingly about him. And there does, at least to me, seem to be some sense of, for a guy who felt disgruntled with Detroit and wanted to get out of there and took a year away, he comes back into this. He gets waived. He's going to rejoin with the Long Island Nets. And this does feel like, I know with the injury, but it at least feels like the Nets organization said, we like you. We like what you're doing. We want to keep working with you. If you're willing to do it in Long Island, then you have a no pressure scenario to try to build yourself back up, come back from the injury, maybe work on some things, right? Try to figure out that shot with a zero spotlight, zero pressure scenario. No one's going to be covering or reporting what Killian Hayes is doing in Long Island unless it's lighting the world on fire. And then you can start to think about things a little bit differently.
Yeah, again, I mean, we've not going to break the Killian Hayes mention on the podcast streak today, right? It might happen one day, but that streak's not going to be broken today. We've said, I honestly think we've mentioned his name. I have to go. I'm not going to go back and look because why bother? But I'll just guess that we've mentioned his name 28 consecutive podcasts, something like that. Like just dropped his name in there.
That feels
just
right.
Mentioned it. And it's just because there's reasons to get excited about it. So not to go too crazy down this rabbit hole, because I will say, if he's going to play in Long Island, it's similar to what we said with Dariq Whitehead last time, which was, if you are going to go to Long Island, if you're going to go to the G League, you have to just absolutely crush it. You have to crush it in the G League. It can't just be like, okay. It has to be, you're the best player in the G League. Yep. If you're not that, outside of like some of these bigs that do need a little help, right? They need help just getting them the ball on offense. They need help in pick and roll. Like they just can't break the guys off the dribble. It's a little different with that, but kind of similar to Summer League. If you're a guard or an on-ball wing, you have to just smoke the G League, and to even consider it. And so we said it with Dariq, and I'll say it with Killian Hayes too. He's got to go down there and be like the best player there by far before you can really start getting excited about it.
And that's what I wonder what context the Nets put it in for him. I'm sure it's just, hey, it's an opportunity, but we know we're going to make these trades. Guys are going to move. So there's a world. Take a half a season. Show how good you can be. As you mentioned, dominate. It's like we talk about with Dariq. You want to see in Summer League? Come out and knock down some shots. Okay, you're not there yet, whether it's physical or otherwise. So if you go down and you look that part, you can say, take your time. And then when we move the veterans from the backcourt, like Schroeder, like maybe Shake Milton, we'll go ahead. We'll pull your rate up for a half season on the back end of this and give you every opportunity to cement yourself a role going forward for this team. So it probably, I mean, almost 100% has to be the best scenario for Killian Hayes. When you look around the NBA, I don't know another team that would have taken a flyer on him outside of the Brooklyn Nets, right? There's not a lot of them. Maybe Washington, because they're also bad and they don't care and they're in a tank too. But this might be his only real best shot to have no pressure and also maximum opportunity by the end of the year to have us look back and say, we mentioned him for 28 straight days. Then we didn't mention him for 125. And the next time we say his name is, he's doing something pretty good down in Long Island, and he has a chance to join the Brooklyn Nets team to close out the year.
Also, if I was Killian Hayes, let's say there were multiple teams that were interested, and I bet there were. I bet there was other teams that wanted to do.
I would come into camp and then get kicked to the curb, and nobody cares.
I would just choose this team too, because it's the cleanest way to kind of envision playing time, right? Like if you go to any other team, and it's going to be much more difficult to envision sort of how the path you can actually carve up for himself on there. Go through the rosters of every team. If the path isn't there, there's just, even on Washington, right? Like that has some young guys that are going to play. Still has Jordan Poole, right? Maybe it's a little easier there. Maybe that's is the one other place. But outside of those two teams, you really can't go around the league and find any place that doesn't have some young guys that would be for sure blockers. Right. Or the team just is not in a test it out and find out kind of mode right around their guy. So even if I was him, and there's a world where I was him and every team offered the same opportunity, I might still do the Nets because
still be top of the list.
Because hey, Schroeder gets traded. We know he's not here in a year. It's going to be some young players. The expectations are on the lower side, but I can probably really show out.
Play alongside Cam Thomas potentially. Like that's a really nice.
Not like all these dudes
alongside.
Right. It's not like there's a ton of guys competing for shots. Barely any guys in the Nets can get their own shot. So it's not like there's not some just huge usage concerns. I think so. This is probably what ends up being one of the best options, even if you felt like he had a robust market around the lower end kind of like, he's not available for two ways, but like the lower end G League deals, right? Like this still might be the best landing spot simply because of the perceived opportunity.
And I will, just before we close out here, let everybody know that because you're going to get Keon Johnson is going to make the opening day roster, as is Jalen Wilson, which was nothing that we didn't expect when it comes to Wilson. But just from a money standpoint for them, boy, he will be on the opening day roster, Jalen Wilson, and that's going to get him $325,000. Keon Johnson gets $700,000 for making the roster. Something's out of whack here. Jalen Wilson's been storming. He's MVP of the Summer League, and he's getting overtaken in terms of those little bonuses, but they'll both obviously be on the opening day roster, and that'll be a fun watch for these two players as well, as their roles are probably the most likely to see increase in opportunity as the season progresses as well.
All right, we're going to get out of here. A couple quick housekeeping notes. Make sure you go over to we.nets.com. That's we.nets.com. Grab that free copy of your season guide. It's just 4 stories about this season, kind of taking a look back at the offseason, what to expect from the year coming up. We got stuff about Cam Thomas, Noah Clowney, Jordy Fernandez, the draft picks, the lottery. It's all there, and it's totally free. Just put in your email over at we.nets.com.
All right, my friends, as we all know, the beginning is the most important part of the work, and that is from one Plateau.
Oh, Plateau. R.I.P., man. One of the all-time great poets. So we're back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.